The year is 1095. A restless wind moves across the plains of Europe, whispering through the monasteries and stone villages of a continent both weary and devout. It is a world caught between faith and famine, between fear and hope. The old order of Rome is long gone, and yet the people still dream of purpose, of redemption. Across the hills of France, peasants work the frozen soil, monks ring their bells, and distant kings ponder their rivalries. But somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the forests, beyond the Alps, and across the endless sand, lies a city. A city whispered about in sermons, sung about in pilgrim tales, and painted in gold on the pages of holy manuscripts, Jerusalem. For centuries, that city had been a destination of the faithful. Pilgrims would travel from distant lands to kneel at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was said to have risen from the tomb. Some made it home. Many did not. The roads were long. Bandits were cruel. And by the end of the 11th century, the city was in the hands of a new and powerful dynasty, the Seljuk Turks. These were not the old rulers of the Caliphate, but fierce newcomers from the steppes, whose arrival had shaken the Muslim world as much as the Christian. They had defeated the Byzantine armies, seized cities, and pushed deep into lands once thought unassailable. Even Constantinople, the shining capital of the Eastern Empire, trembled. And so, when Emperor Alexios Komnenos sent envoys to the west pleading for aid, his words carried across the mountains to one man, a man whose decision would ignite the medieval world like dry straw in a flame. His name was Pope Urban II. At this time, Urban was a man beset by challenges. The church was divided, kings were defiant, and rival priests claimed God's authority for themselves. But here, in the emperor's desperate plea, he saw a chance for unity, a way to gather the princes of Christendom under one banner, not against each other, but toward a single holy cause. And so, in November of 1095, in the French town of Clermont, the Pope stood before a sea of nobles and clergymen. The air was cold, the crowd restless. None knew that what they were about to hear would change the course of history. Urban's words, though their exact phrasing is lost to time, echoed through the centuries. He spoke of a land desecrated, of Christian brothers in the East crying for help, of sacred places defiled and pilgrims slaughtered. And then he called upon all who could bear arms to march eastward, not for conquest, but for redemption. He promised that any who took up the cross and went to liberate Jerusalem would have their sins forgiven, washed clean in the eyes of God. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, from the crowd, came a cry. Deus vult! God wills it! The word spread like wildfire. Within months, from Normandy to Lombardy, from the forests of Germany to the vineyards of Provence, men and women began to sew small crosses of red cloth onto their garments, the symbol of their vow, the mark of a pilgrim warrior. Some went for faith, others for fortune, some out of fear, and others out of a strange, contagious hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay the holy city, and with it, the promise of salvation. The movement grew faster than anyone could control. Great lords and petty knights, farmers and beggars, even children, began to march eastward. The roads filled with the sound of footsteps, of hymns, of wagon wheels creaking under the weight of both armor and dream. And yet, beneath that holy purpose lay a darkness, the kind that always follows human zeal. In the Rhineland, mobs of so-called Crusaders turned their fury upon Jewish communities, slaughtering thousands in the name of a God who surely wept at the sight. Others died along the way from hunger or disease, never even reaching the borders of Byzantium. This first wave, led not by nobles but by preachers and zealots, would later be called the People's Crusade. Among its leaders was Peter the Hermit, a wiry, bearded monk who claimed to have seen visions of Christ commanding him to free the Holy Land. Peter's charisma drew crowds of peasants and outcasts. They carried no discipline, no true weapons, only faith. Some rode donkeys, others walked barefoot. They begged food from towns and villages as they passed. But When this ragged army reached the borders of the Byzantine Empire, it became clear how unprepared they truly were. Emperor Alexios, anxious and wary, hurried them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor. And there, beneath the burning Anatolian sun, the Seljuk Turks awaited. Few of the People's Crusade would ever return. Their bones, scattered across the plains, became the first grim offering to an idea that would consume generations. And yet, behind them came a far more formidable force, the Prince's Crusade. Among its leaders were men whose names would echo through history. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, noble, devout, and fiercely loyal to his cause. Raymond of Toulouse, a seasoned warrior driven as much by faith as ambition. Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning son of a Norman adventurer whose sharp mind and sharper sword made him both ally and rival. And there was Robert of Normandy, brother to the King of England, seeking glory far from home. These were not fanatics or wanderers. They were knights, men of iron and oath, used to battle and bound by complex loyalties. They took the same vow, stitched the same cross, and set out to reclaim Jerusalem. By 1097, their armies had gathered outside Constantinople, a glittering host of tens of thousands. The emperor, both relieved and alarmed, required them to swear allegiance, promising that any lands recovered from the Turks would be returned to Byzantine control. Some agreed in words. Others, silently, planned otherwise. Crossing into Asia, the Crusaders faced their first great trial, the Siege of Nicaea. Nicaea was no mere fortress. It was the heart of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, surrounded by solid walls and a shimmering lake. The Turks inside were confident. The Christians outside were determined. For weeks, siege engines battered the walls, while archers exchanged volleys under the unrelenting sun. Food ran low. Disease spread. Yet the Crusaders held firm. And then, in a twist of fortune, the city fell not to their assault, but to negotiation. The Byzantines, moving swiftly and quietly, arranged for the garrison to surrender directly to them. When the Crusaders awoke to find the imperial banners flying above Nicaea, they were furious. Victory had been stolen from their hands. Still, the march continued. From Nicaea, they turned toward Antioch, but between them lay the blazing plains of Dorylaeum. There, in June of 1097, the Crusaders faced the full might of the Turkish cavalry. Swift horsemen circled them, arrows darkening the sky. Panic threatened to break their ranks. But then, like a miracle, reinforcements arrived. The armies of Godfrey and Raymond charging in from the rear, shattering the Turks and turning chaos into triumph. The field was strewn with bodies and broken lances. And though victory was theirs, many began to see how perilous this journey truly was. The summer heat scorched them. The land offered little food. Horses died by the thousands. And yet still they pressed on, through mountains and rivers, through lands both hostile and strange, following the shimmering idea of Jerusalem like a star in the desert. By the autumn of 1097, they reached the towering walls of Antioch, an ancient city whose stones had seen empires rise and fall. Here began one of the most grueling sieges of the entire Crusade. For 8 long months, the Crusaders surrounded Antioch. They built siege towers, fought off sorties, and starved beside the very walls they hoped to conquer. Disease claimed them by the hundreds. Winter winds blew through the camps. Men gnawed on leather to keep hunger at bay. Yet, through suffering, their resolve deepened into something beyond reason, a kind of holy endurance. Then, in the summer of 1098, betrayal opened the gates. A tower guard, bribed or converted, allowed Bowman's men to climb the walls under cover of night. The city fell, but almost immediately the Crusaders themselves became the besieged. A massive Muslim army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived, encircling the city and trapping the exhausted Crusaders within. What followed was despair and legend. Amid the starvation and fear, a supposed miracle was proclaimed. The discovery of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. Whether true or not, it reignited their spirits. They marched out of Antioch, gaunt and staggering, yet blazing with faith. And against all odds, they routed the enemy. When the dust settled, Antioch belonged to the Crusaders. But victory had changed them. Some sought glory, others power. Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself, breaking his vow to the emperor. The unity that had carried them this far began to fray. Still the goal remained: Jerusalem. It would take another year of hardship before they reached its gates. In June of 1099, the Crusaders, fewer than half of those who had begun the march, arrived at the Holy City. The sight moved many to tears. Pilgrims dropped to their knees. Knights removed their helmets, gazing upon the walls they had dreamed of for years. But Jerusalem would not open its gates willingly. The Fatimid garrison within was strong, the walls high. Once again, siege engines were built. Once again, the sun beat down mercilessly. For weeks they fought, not only against the defenders, but against thirst, disease, and doubt. Some wondered if God had abandoned them. And then, on a blazing July morning, the Crusaders launched their final assault. From the north and the south they climbed, scaling ladders and towers as arrows rained down. Godfrey himself fought at the front, his golden hair glinting in the sun. By noon, the cross was raised above the walls. Jerusalem, after centuries of Muslim rule, had fallen. What followed was both triumph and tragedy. In the fury of victory, the Crusaders unleashed a terrible massacre. Blood ran through the streets of the Holy City. Muslim and Jew alike were cut down. Churches rang their bells, while screams echoed through the narrow alleys. And yet, to the survivors, it seemed that heaven had touched earth. They prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, barefoot, weeping, certain that they had fulfilled a divine command. A new kingdom was born from that day, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its first ruler, chosen not as king but as advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, was Godfrey of Bouillon. He refused to wear a crown of gold in the city where his saviour had worn one of thorns. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the world had been remade. But time would show that the conquest of Jerusalem was not an ending. It was the beginning of something far larger, a cycle of wars, dreams, and sorrows that would stretch across generations. As the sun set over the blood-stained stones of the Holy City, few among the Crusaders could imagine how fragile their triumph truly was, or how many more would march under that same red cross, chasing both faith and fate into the deserts beyond. The summer of 1187 was hot beyond memory. The earth cracked beneath the hooves of marching men, and the wind itself felt dry as ash. From every direction, the banners of Islam moved toward a single point on the map, toward destiny. Saladin rode at their head, calm, composed, his face shaded beneath a simple white turban. He was no longer the quiet commander from Egypt, but a figure of near-mythic reverence. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the stillness of conviction. He did not promise victory. He spoke of duty, of faith, of patience. Across the desert, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem stirred in uneasy panic. Messengers arrived daily, bearing tales of towns falling, fortresses surrendering, and the endless host advancing from the east. King Guy of Lusignan gathered what strength remained: the knights of the temple, the hospitallers, and the barons of the realm. They rode out from Acre, banners snapping in the scorching wind, their armour glinting like mirrors under the sun. Some went willingly, some hesitantly, yet all knew that this would decide the fate of everything they had built for nearly a century. They carried with them the relic of the true cross, believed to bear a fragment of the wood on which Christ had been crucified. To the soldiers, it was not merely a relic. It was divine protection, a sign that heaven itself would march beside them. But the desert is not kind to faith alone. For days, Saladin's scouts harried the Crusaders' flanks, cutting them off from water, setting fire to the dry grass ahead of their march. The smoke stung their eyes, their throats burned with thirst. The sun climbed higher each day, and the very air shimmered like molten glass. By the time they reached the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee, their strength was all but gone. Saladin encircled them. Night fell, heavy and merciless. The Crusaders could see the fires of the Muslim camp glowing all around, 1,000 flickering points of orange light in the darkness. They heard drums in the distance and the low hum of voices reciting verses of the Quran. Sleep did not come easily that night. When dawn broke on July 4th, 1187, the battle began. The Franks fought bravely, desperate, half mad with thirst. They tried again and again to break through the encircling line, but each time they were driven back by showers of arrows and the blinding smoke of burning brush. The relic of the true cross was raised high above them, a symbol of hope amid ruin. But by midday, the relic fell, captured by Saladin's men. Its fall broke the last thread of their resolve. King Guy was taken alive, along with the Grand Master of the Templars. Raynald of Chatillon, the man who had defied every truce, who had slaughtered pilgrims under Saladin's protection, was brought before the Sultan. Saladin offered him water. Then, as the story goes, he struck him down himself, saying, "It is not fitting for kings to kill kings," but that man broke every oath. When the fighting ended, the Crusader army was gone. The desert floor was silent, save for the crows. The age of the Crusader kingdom, strong, defiant and proud, had ended in the dust at Hattin. In the weeks that followed, Saladin's armies swept across Palestine like a tide returning to its shore. City after city opened its gates. Acre surrendered. Nablus, Jaffa, Beirut all fell with little bloodshed. And at last, only Jerusalem remained. Inside its walls, panic and despair mingled with prayer. The Patriarch of Jerusalem led processions through the streets, urging repentance. Men wept openly. Women clutched their children and icons. They had heard what had happened at Hattin. They knew no army was coming. Balian of Ibelin, one of the last surviving lords of the realm, took charge of the defense. He had sworn to Saladin that he would not take up arms again, having been granted safe passage to retrieve his family. But seeing the terror within the city, he begged permission to break that oath, to defend Jerusalem for honor's sake, not pride. Saladin, with characteristic grace, consented. For 12 days, the siege wore on. Saladin's catapults rained stones upon the walls. His miners dug beneath the towers. Inside, the people prayed, fasted, and prepared for death. Then, on the morning of October 2nd, 1187, exactly 88 years after the city had first fallen to the Crusaders, Jerusalem surrendered. But there was no massacre. No orgy of vengeance, no rivers of blood as there had been in 1099. Saladin forbade it. Instead, he ordered that the Christians be ransomed, not slain. Those who could pay were allowed to leave freely. Those who could not, the poor, the widowed, the children, were given mercy. Saladin himself paid many of their ransoms from his own treasury. When he entered the city, he did not do so in triumph. He dismounted at the gates, bowed his head, and walked barefoot through the streets to the Dome of the Rock. There, the muezzin's call rose again after nearly a century of silence. The city of peace, once drenched in blood, breathed again. Word of the loss spread swiftly through Europe. It struck like thunder. Pope Urban III is said to have died from the shock. The bells of Rome tolled, and across the continent, kings and peasants alike fell to their knees. The holy city was gone. From this grief rose the Third Crusade, called by the new Pope, Gregory VIII, and led by the mightiest rulers of Christendom. Frederick Barbarossa, the Emperor of Germany, Philip Augustus, King of France, and Richard, King of England, the man history would name the Lionheart. They came not as pilgrims, but as warriors of renown. And for a time, it seemed as though all of Europe itself might descend upon the East once more. In 1189, their fleets arrived upon the shores of Acre, beginning what would become one of the longest and most bitter sieges in the age of the Crusades. Saladin's armies encircled the city from without, while the Crusaders fought to take it from within. Disease ravaged both sides. The heat was suffocating, the stench unbearable. For 2 long years, neither side would yield. Frederick Barbarossa drowned on his way through Anatolia. Philip of France returned home in frustration. Only Richard remained, bold, unpredictable, relentless. When Acre finally fell in 1191, it was to Richard's banner. And though he admired Saladin, he also understood him as no other could, not merely as a foe, but as an equal. The two men never met face to face, but their respect for one another grew like an unspoken friendship. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent him fruit, ice, and his own physicians. When Saladin's soldiers captured Christian prisoners, Richard ransomed them honourably. In the midst of endless bloodshed, chivalry itself seemed to take on human form through the balance of their rivalry. Yet neither could achieve what they truly desired. Richard lacked the strength to retake Jerusalem. Saladin had no wish to destroy what remained of the Crusaders utterly. Both were weary. Both longed for peace. In 1192, they made a truce. The Crusaders would keep the coast, from Tyre to Jaffa. Pilgrims could once more travel to Jerusalem in safety. And the Holy City would remain under Muslim rule. Both were weary. Both longed for peace. It was not victory nor defeat. It was a fragile peace, one born of exhaustion, wisdom, and respect. Months later, Saladin returned to Damascus. His empire, once united by purpose, now rested upon his shoulders alone. He lived simply, as he always had, sleeping on the floor, giving away wealth to the poor. When he died in 1193, the great Sultan left behind no treasure, no gold, no palaces filled with jewels. His servants found only a single gold coin, a silver one, and a few copper pieces. He had given everything away. They say that as his funeral procession moved through the streets, a herald walked before it, calling out, "Behold the man who conquered the world and takes nothing with him but his faith." The fortresses would crumble, rebuilt, and fall again. But the memory of that moment, when mercy triumphed over vengeance, when two enemies found honor in one another, would endure long after the dust of the desert had settled. And so, as the night deepens and the centuries drift by like sand through the fingers of time, the wind moves again over the empty plains where armies once clashed. The stars burn quietly above Jerusalem, as they always have. And if you listen closely, through the hum of the earth and the echo of distant prayers, you might still hear it, the faint whisper of peace, at last returning home. The desert sleeps beneath a silver moon. The wind moves softly over the dunes, carrying with it the faint scent of myrrh and dust. In the quiet heart of the East, a new power is stirring, not with noise or fury, but with patience. The Crusaders hold their fragile kingdom, a scattering of stone fortresses between the mountains and the sea. To the west lies the glittering Mediterranean, to the east an ocean of sand and silence. They have built churches where mosques once stood, castles upon the bones of old empires. But their world, though sacred to them, is small and shrinking. Beyond their walls, Muslim unity is awakening. In Damascus, under the rule of Nur ad-Din, a vision begins to take shape, not merely to resist the Crusaders, but to reclaim the lands of Islam and restore a single, righteous order. Nur ad-Din is unlike his father, Zengi. He is quiet, devout, measured. He sleeps on a simple mat, eats coarse bread, and spends his nights in prayer. His soldiers revere him not for his wrath, but for his justice. He rebuilds schools and mosques, revives the courts of law, and gathers poets and scholars around him. To his followers, he is not merely a ruler, he is a servant of God. And among those who serve him, there is one man whose name, though little known yet, will one day echo through history like a prayer. A young Kurdish general, soft-spoken, loyal and unassuming, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. At this time, Saladin is not yet the great leader the world will remember. He is the nephew of Shirkuh, one of Nur ad-Din's most trusted commanders. He listens more than he speaks. He studies his master's calm patience, his sense of duty. In a world of ambition and pride, Saladin seems almost reluctant, drawn not to glory but to purpose. The years pass quietly. The Franks in Jerusalem strengthen their borders. Their young king, Baldwin III, rules wisely, keeping uneasy peace with his Muslim neighbours. Trade flows again through the ports of Acre and Tyre. Pilgrims still come to kneel at the Holy Sepulchre. But beyond the sands, far to the south, Egypt stirs. For centuries, Egypt had been the jewel of the Muslim world, rich, fertile, powerful. Yet now, by the 1160s, it is a realm divided and weary. The ruling Fatimid Caliphate, long weakened by corruption and intrigue, teeters on collapse. Its viziers plot against one another, and the Crusaders of Jerusalem watch with hungry eyes, dreaming of the day they might claim Cairo's wealth for themselves. It is in this turbulence that Nur ad-Din makes his move. He sends his old general Shirkuh, and with him the young Saladin, to intervene in Egypt's affairs, ostensibly to restore order, but also to extend his influence. Their arrival sparks years of shifting alliances, betrayals and battles along the Nile. Shirkuh wins victories, then retreats, returns again and is hailed as vizier, only to die suddenly, leaving a vacuum at the heart of Cairo's power. And into that vacuum steps Saladin. At first, he is cautious. The Fatimid court is a nest of serpents, filled with spies, factions, and old loyalties. But Saladin moves quietly, with the same patience he had learned from Nur ad-Din. He wins the trust of his soldiers. He eases tensions with the populace. He re-establishes justice in a land long divided by corruption. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he begins to reshape Egypt in his image. In 1171, the last Fatimid caliph dies. With him ends the Shia dynasty that had ruled Egypt for centuries. Saladin, now vizier and de facto ruler, restores allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, uniting Egypt once more with the greater Muslim world. It is a moment of quiet revolution. Without thunder, without blood, a new order has begun. Word of his rise reaches Nur ad-Din in Damascus. The old master feels both pride and unease. For though Saladin calls himself a servant of his lord, power, once tasted, cannot easily be surrendered. The two men, mentor and student, idealist and realist, drift toward inevitable rivalry. But before their conflict can unfold, fate intervenes. In 1174, Nur ad-Din dies unexpectedly, leaving behind a young son and an empire trembling on the edge of fragmentation. Saladin moves swiftly, not as a usurper, but as a guardian. He marches north with his armies, entering Damascus, the very city where his master had once ruled. Some oppose him, others welcome him, but all soon recognize the same thing. This man has the rarest of gifts, not merely the will to rule, but the grace to unify. By the late 1170s, Saladin has done what few before him could. He has united Egypt and Syria under one banner. The dream that Zengi began, that Nur ad-Din nurtured, now lives fully in him. And while the Muslim world gathers under Saladin's steady hand, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem begins to fade. Its strength is divided among quarrelsome lords. Its kings grow weak, its faith turns to complacency. The glittering palaces of Jerusalem are filled with feasts and politics, while its fortresses on the borders grow neglected. The crown now rests upon the head of King Baldwin IV, a boy barely 15, afflicted with a terrible disease. Leprosy. It began as numbness in his hand, a strange loss of feeling. By the time he reached his majority, the illness had spread, stealing his strength, his sight, his very flesh. Yet Baldwin's mind remained sharp, and his spirit unbreakable. Those who knew him spoke of his courage with awe. He would ride into battle, his hands wrapped in bandages, his face hidden behind a silver mask, leading his knights with calm authority. He knew he would die young, and yet he ruled as though eternity were only a heartbeat away. Between Saladin and Baldwin, two worlds stood face to face, the Muslim and the Christian, the devout and the doomed, the rising and the fading. And though they met rarely in person, their stories became entwined. In 1177, Saladin marched north from Egypt with a great host, intending to strike at the heart of the Crusader kingdom. He believed Jerusalem would fall easily, its king a boy, its armies scattered. But at a place called Monjazar, near Ramla, he met Baldwin in battle. The leper king, pale and frail, rode at the head of his knights, the relic of the true cross carried before them. Against all odds, the Crusaders shattered Saladin's army. The desert itself seemed to turn against the invader. Saladin escaped with only a handful of men. For Baldwin, it was a moment of triumph, and perhaps divine mercy. For Saladin, it was a lesson in humility. He retreated to Egypt, rebuilt his forces, and waited. He did not rage nor despair. He knew time itself was his ally. The years passed, and both men changed. Baldwin's disease worsened. His face was disfigured, his body failing. Yet he continued to rule, relying on his sister Sibylla and her husband, Guy of Lusignan. The court of Jerusalem grew divided, factions forming around rival claims to power. Saladin, meanwhile, continued to expand his dominion. He took Aleppo, subdued Mosul, and negotiated truces that left him free to turn his eyes once more toward the south. But this time, he would not rush. He would prepare carefully, drawing his enemies into a single, decisive strike. In 1183, Baldwin led what would be his last campaign, a tense stalemate against Saladin's army near the town of Beit Shan. Neither side prevailed. Yet, even in retreat, Baldwin's courage inspired his men. He was carried on a litter, unable to ride, but still commanding with calm authority. The following year, his illness confined him to his bed. He died not long after, at the age of 24, leaving behind a kingdom already crumbling beneath the weight of its own divisions. Saladin mourned the news in his own way. For though they had been enemies, he admired Baldwin's honour, his dignity, his restraint. The age of noble kings was ending, and both men seemed to know it. Now the crown of Jerusalem passed to Guy of Lusignan, ambitious, inexperienced, and surrounded by those who sought glory more than wisdom. Among them was Raynald of Chatillon, a lord of cruel reputation, who raided Muslim caravans even during truces, attacking pilgrims and merchants under Saladin's protection. For Saladin, this was no longer war, it was sacrilege. He swore that he would answer not with vengeance, but with justice. By 1186, his empire stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates, his armies disciplined and united. He was patient no longer. The time for preparation had ended. The time for reckoning had come. Across the lands of Islam, his call went out, not for plunder, but for liberation. Men from Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and beyond gathered under the green banners of jihad. Their purpose was clear: to reclaim the holy city that had been lost nearly a century before. The desert winds shifted once again. The age of kings was giving way to the age of legends. Soon, the sun would rise over the horns of Hattin, and the world would tremble beneath it. The year is 1100. The holy city rests beneath the evening sun, its golden domes glimmering in the fading light. Pilgrims enter its gates, barefoot and trembling, whispering prayers that echo softly through the narrow streets. The cross now flies over Jerusalem, but peace, as always, is fleeting. Godfrey of Bouillon, the humble hero who refused a crown, lived only 1 year after the conquest. In his place rose Baldwin I, his brother, a man of strength and ambition. Where Godfrey saw Jerusalem as a shrine, Baldwin saw it as a kingdom to be ruled. Under his reign, the kingdom of Jerusalem began to take form, fragile, sun-baked, and surrounded by enemies. The Crusaders had carved out 4 territories in the east. The county of Edessa, a lonely frontier fortress in the north. The Principality of Antioch, ruled by Bohemond and his descendants. The county of Tripoli along the Phoenician coast. And at the heart, the kingdom of Jerusalem, shining but vulnerable. For a time, these states thrived, or at least they survived. Merchants arrived from Genoa and Venice, bringing spices and silks. Pilgrims from Europe came in endless waves, filling the streets with new tongues and eager devotion. The rulers of Jerusalem built castles across the hills, solid angular fortresses of pale limestone, to guard their borders against the ever-watchful Muslim realms beyond. Yet peace in the Holy Land was always an illusion. Beyond the deserts and river valleys, a new generation was rising, sharper, more united, and driven by the memory of loss. Among them was a warrior named Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul. His name, whispered in the markets of Aleppo and Damascus, carried a promise that one day the infidels would be driven from the lands of Islam. Zengi was ruthless, cunning, and patient. He understood that victory would not come from scattered raids or divided emirs. It required unity, a single, determined will. And so he forged alliances, struck bargains, and began to build the foundation of a renewed Muslim strength. While Europe feasted and prayed in the glow of victory, Zengi was waiting. By the 1140s, the Crusader states were stretched thin. They relied on reinforcements that rarely came and on alliances with local Muslim princes that could shift overnight. Then, in the winter of 1144, Zengi made his move. He turned his gaze toward Edessa, the oldest of the Crusader states and the weakest. Its walls were tall, but its defenders few. When Zengi's forces surrounded the city, the defenders sent desperate appeals to Jerusalem and to Europe beyond. But help did not come in time. After a brutal siege, Edessa fell. It was the first great loss of the Crusader world, a shattering moment. The churches of Europe fell silent in mourning. Priests wept in their pulpits. Bells rang not for victory, but for despair. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Holy Land seemed in danger of slipping away. In France, a monk named Bernard of Clairvaux, known for his calm voice and burning faith, rose to answer that danger. He preached that the fall of Edessa was not the end, but a test. A new crusade must rise, not of adventurers or mercenaries, but of kings. And so, from the pulpits of Vézelay, his words spread like gentle fire. Among those who listened was King Louis VII of France, pious, young, and eager to redeem himself after years of misfortune. And across the Rhine, another monarch answered the call, Conrad III of Germany, proud and warlike. For the first time, a crusade would be led not by dukes or counts, but by crowned kings. It was a noble vision, Europe's might united under the banner of the cross. But reality, as it so often does, proved far harsher. In 1147, the two great armies began their march east. Louis's host shimmered with banners, knights, and clerics, a moving cathedral of steel and song. Conrad's Germans, marching ahead, numbered in the tens of thousands. They crossed the Danube, passed through Hungary, and entered Byzantine lands, where suspicion awaited them. The emperor, Manuel Komnenos, remembered all too well how the first Crusaders had seized Antioch and broken their oaths. To him, these new armies were not saviors, but a threat. Tension hung heavy in the air. Misunderstandings turned to skirmishes. Food ran short. Still, the Crusaders pressed on, crossing into Asia Minor, where Zengi's successors watched and waited. In the autumn of 1147, Conrad's army reached Dorylaeum, the same plain where 50 years earlier the first Crusaders had triumphed. But this time, fate turned cold. The Turks harassed them from the hills, their arrows slicing through the hot wind. Conrad's knights charged, but the enemy melted away, drawing them into ambushes. When the battle was done, the German army lay broken, its survivors limping back through the mountains, hungry and shattered. Louis's French host fared little better. They marched through valleys scorched by sun and emptied of food. The Turks attacked at every turn, their horses moving like ghosts through the dust. At Mount Cadmus, the Crusaders' column stretched too long, and when the rear was ambushed, chaos rippled through the ranks. Men fell from cliffs, trampled one another, or simply disappeared into the wilderness. What had begun as a grand procession of kings had turned into a slow disaster. By the time they reached the coast, only fragments of their armies remained. The survivors took ship for Antioch, the once proud city still held by the Franks. There, Louis VII was received by his wife, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose sharp wit and restless spirit soon became the talk of the entire crusade. Louis wished to continue to Jerusalem. Eleanor, entranced by the cultured court of Antioch, wished to remain. Their quarrels grew fierce, whispered about by knights and priests alike. The journey that had begun as a sacred vow was unraveling into scandal. Eventually, Louis pressed onward, but what awaited him was not glory. Together with Conrad, he met with Baldwin III of Jerusalem, the young king who now ruled in the Holy City. They agreed upon a plan: to attack Damascus, one of the richest cities in the Muslim world. It was a bold choice, but a disastrous one. In July of 1148, the armies of the Second Crusade marched upon Damascus, surrounding its gardens and orchards. The city's defenders fought fiercely, and within days, the Crusaders' supply lines began to fail. The heat was merciless, the morale worse. Rumors of treachery spread. Some said the Crusaders had secretly changed sides. Others said the local Christians had betrayed them. After only 4 days, the siege was abandoned. The kings retreated in humiliation, their men silent, their banners tattered. The Second Crusade had failed. Back in Europe, the news spread slowly, first in disbelief, then in sorrow. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had preached the Holy Call, was devastated. He blamed himself, saying, "If I must glory, I will glory in my shame." In the East, the Muslim world rejoiced. The victory confirmed what Zengi had begun, that the Franks could be defeated. Zengi himself had died 2 years earlier, assassinated in his sleep by a servant's blade, but his dream had outlived him. In his place rose a man of quiet brilliance, his son Nur ad-Din. Unlike his father, Nur ad-Din was not driven by cruelty or greed. He was austere, pious, and disciplined, a ruler who saw jihad not as vengeance, but as duty. Under his rule, Aleppo and Damascus were united. Mosques were built, scholars gathered, and justice was administered with calm precision. To the Crusader states, Nur ad-Din was a shadow always near, patient, deliberate, waiting for his moment. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Baldwin III struggled to hold his fragile kingdom together. He was young, intelligent, and fair-minded, but his resources were thin. The castles of the Franks, Crac des Chevaliers, Queyrac, and others, stood like islands in a hostile sea. Each year, the lines of defense crept inward, like a tide receding from the shore. And yet, even as the frontiers narrowed, something else was happening, something quiet but profound. Between Christians and Muslims, between pilgrims and merchants, there grew an uneasy familiarity. Trade resumed, truces were made, and letters crossed the deserts bearing the seals of both sides. The Holy Land became not just a battlefield, but a fragile bridge between two worlds. By the late 1150s, the generation of the Second Crusade was fading. Louis VII returned to France, his marriage to Eleanor broken beyond repair. She would later marry Henry of Anjou, and together they would become the parents of Richard the Lionheart. Conrad III died in 1152, leaving the German crown to his nephew, Frederick Barbarossa, a man whose name would one day echo in crusading legend. In the east, Nur ad-Din's influence continued to grow. He took Damascus, securing the very city that the Crusaders had failed to claim. From there, he looked southward, toward Jerusalem. But fate had another figure to unveil, a young Kurdish warrior in his service known as Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History would remember him by a simpler name, Saladin. At this time, he was still just a loyal general, quiet and observant. He studied Nur ad-Din's ways, his patience, his humility, his vision of a united Islam. It would take years for that vision to blossom fully. But the seeds had been planted. As the sun set on the middle of the 12th century, the Crusader kingdom still stood, battered, but alive. Its towers caught the last light of day, its knights still rode along the walls, and pilgrims still sang hymns in the Holy Sepulchre. But beneath that calm, the earth was shifting. The world was preparing for something greater, something both terrible and magnificent. The next crusade would not be born from desperation, but from destiny. It would bring forth kings and warriors whose names would never fade, men like Richard of England, Philip of France, and the great Saladin himself. For now, though, the night falls softly over Jerusalem. The city sleeps, cradled in uneasy peace. Somewhere in the darkened desert, a young commander looks up at the stars and whispers a prayer in Arabic, not for conquest, but for unity. And though no one can yet see it, history is quietly turning its page. The world after Saladin moved more slowly, as though time itself paused to breathe. The great Sultan was gone. The conqueror who had reclaimed Jerusalem now lay in the earth he had fought to protect, buried not beneath a mountain of gold, but beneath a simple cloth and a whisper of prayers. Across the lands of Islam, his empire began to soften around the edges. Brothers argued over provinces. Generals eyed each other with suspicion. Yet even in that quiet unraveling, his name lingered like incense, not feared, but loved. And far away in the cold stone courts of Europe, his legend grew larger than life. In the telling, even his enemies spoke of him as a man touched by grace. In England, King Richard, the Lionheart, returned home to find a crown heavy with debt and unrest. He had fought his wars, won his glory, but left his country nearly bankrupt. He would never see the Holy Land again. In 1199, an arrow struck him down at a small castle in France. So ended the last of the great Crusader kings, not in the desert's blaze, but in the quiet mud of his own realm. The truce that Richard and Saladin had forged still held, fragile, flickering, but real. Pilgrims came once more to Jerusalem, walking its ancient streets under Muslim protection. For nearly a decade, the Holy City remained at peace. But peace in that age was a passing guest. The Fourth Crusade was called in 1202, not against Jerusalem, but against an easier, wealthier target, Constantinople. The great Christian capital, the shining heart of Byzantium, fell not to the armies of Islam, but to those who marched under the cross itself. In the spring of 1204, the Crusaders sacked the city, looting its churches, burning its libraries, carrying off relics and gold. The marble streets ran red, not with the blood of enemies, but of fellow Christians. And so, the purpose of the Crusades, That divine calling that had once sent thousands to die for faith began to blur. The cross, once a symbol of unity, had turned upon itself. The dream had curdled into something restless, something hollow. Still, in the West, the yearning for the Holy Land remained. Preachers spoke of Jerusalem as though it were a star, distant, unreachable, but forever shining in the mind. In 1217, a new crusade set forth, the fifth, led by kings of Hungary and Austria, joined later by the Duke of Bavaria. They landed in Egypt, believing that to control the Nile was to control the gateway to the east. They besieged the port city of Damietta for months, battling floods, heat, and disease. When they finally took it, they found themselves trapped between river and desert, surrounded by the very waters they had sought to command. A single mistake, the refusal of their leaders to retreat, cost them everything. The Nile rose in flood, cutting off their escape. Saladin's successors struck, and once more the cross was driven into retreat. The pattern became familiar, each generation sending men eastward and each returning with fewer than they had sent. The Sixth Crusade came not with war but with words. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, scholar, skeptic and ruler of half of Europe, was excommunicated by the Pope, yet went east nonetheless. And in one of the strangest turns of the entire age, he regained Jerusalem without a single battle. Through diplomacy, through calm negotiation with the Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, Frederick secured Christian access to the Holy City for 10 years. No sword was drawn. The gates opened quietly, and the bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre rang once more. For the first time, Jerusalem was won not by force, but by reason. It did not last. When the truce ended, the city returned peacefully to Muslim control, as had been agreed. No great catastrophe followed, no slaughter, no siege, just a soft fading of a borrowed light. The Crusades, once blazing like fire, had cooled into embers. And yet still the embers glowed. The Seventh Crusade rose under the banner of a saint, Louis IX of France, a man of deep faith and gentleness. He led his armies once more to Egypt, believing, as others had, that it was the key to Jerusalem. At first, success smiled upon him. But the Nile is a fickle ally. When the floods came, his army was trapped, cut off and surrounded. Louis himself was captured, a king held in chains, ransomed for a kingdom's worth of gold. He returned to France wiser, humbler, yet unbroken. Years later, in 1270, he set forth again, this time toward Tunisia, hoping to strike at Islam's western edge. But disease found him before battle could. Louis IX, the most pious of all Crusader kings, died not in triumph, but in fever, whispering prayers beneath a burning sun. He was later canonized, remembered not for victory, but for faith. By then, the Crusader world was little more than a ghost of what it had been. The once great cities, Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, stood like lonely islands along the coast, surrounded by lands no longer theirs. Trade had replaced conquest. Pilgrims still came, but the age of holy war had lost its heart. In the east, new powers were rising. The Mongols sweeping across Asia, and in their shadow, the Mamluks of Egypt, fierce warriors who would become the guardians of Islam's southern frontier. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars made it his life's work to erase what remained of the Crusader states. He moved with precision, not in fury, but inevitability. Fortress by fortress, coast by coast, he reclaimed what had once been lost. And so the story neared its quiet end. The year was 1291. Only one city remained in Christian hands. Acre, the jewel of the coast, the last refuge of the Crusader dream. It was a place of merchants and knights, of pilgrims and thieves, a city that seemed to live between two worlds, never quite belonging to either. When the Mamluk armies arrived, their siege engines thundered against its walls for weeks. The Templars and Hospitallers fought with desperate valor, their banners snapping in the sea wind. But there were too many. The walls cracked, the gates splintered, and on a May morning, Acre fell. Those who could fled to the waiting ships, vanishing over the horizon. Those who could not were lost amid the ruin. And with that, after nearly 2 centuries, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land was gone. No crusade would ever return. The cross that had once burned so brightly over Jerusalem now lay dimmed, its purpose consumed by time. But its echoes would never fade, for in its wake came new worlds, new kingdoms, new paths of thought, new bridges between faiths. The Crusades had not brought the peace men had hoped for, but they had changed forever how the West and East would see each other. They left behind ruins and legends, saints and sinners, and a deep, unending memory of what mankind will do for belief, and what belief can endure in return. As centuries drifted on, the castles of the Crusaders turned to stone husks, softened by rain and ivy. The desert reclaimed the battlefields, the cities grew over the bones of the fallen. And through it all, the wind continued its patient whisper across the Holy Lands. Perhaps in that sound there is something eternal. The murmur of forgiveness, the sigh of time washing over the scars of faith. The Crusades began with a cry to reclaim a city, and ended with a quiet lesson. That no place, however sacred, can belong forever to any one people, only to history. And now, as the night deepens and the stars scatter above that ancient land, Jerusalem still sleeps, neither Christian nor Muslim, but simply human. Its stones remember everything. Its silence forgives everything. And its light, that endless golden light, remains for all who seek it.